She left the house to him in a letter written in a hand that trembled with age and certainty. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and the same cigarette smoke that had lived in the corners of Aunt Layla's rooms for as long as he could remember. He read the lines twice, then 3 times, as if clarity could be summoned by repetition. The will was short, crystalline, the kind of instruction that left no room for argument. Live 1 year as the woman I always knew you were. Accept my house, my savings, my things. Do this and everything is yours. Refuse, and everything goes to the foundation. The lawyer's voice in the quiet office had been formal, polite, almost clinical, but his hands had betrayed a small human curiosity as he watched the nephew who'd arrived late to the reading. Inheritance. It began with keys, heavy brass, engraved with a looping L, and a house that felt like a photograph that had been set in motion the moment he crossed its threshold. The house remembered her. Lace curtains still hung in solemn shrouds, a record player waited on the sideboard with dust in its grooves, and a dressing table mirrored a life arranged for someone else. He moved through rooms that belonged to memory, a kitchen that smelled faintly of cardamom and boiled tea, a study with a crooked lamp and stacks of letters tied in blue ribbon, a bedroom that held, beneath the bed, trunks she'd never let anyone open. He told himself he was being reasonable. He could refuse the condition and still be respectable. He could live his life as he always had. Small apartment, anonymous days, the occasional meal with friends who knew him as Tariq, nephew, roommate, engineer. Instead, he found himself spending nights at the little house on Elm Street, sleep stolen in the chestnut armchair that had once been Aunt Layla's. The house had a patience about it, an insistence that things would be done properly if he only listened. When dawn found him awake with the sunlight like pale coins spilled across the carpet, he would walk to the dressing room and, with a trembling hand, lift the lid of one of those trunks. Inside was a world done in silk and sequins, in perfume bottles and hairpins. He had held these things before, awkwardly, as a child helping to dust the spare room, but they were different now. Precise, luminous, bearing the faint impression of someone's fingers. Each garment had a story tucked into its seams. A pink dress with a tiny rip at the hem that suggested a stolen laughter and a garden path. A pair of heels, modest in height, scuffed neatly on the insides. She had walked in them, had worried for comfort and still chosen them. There were handwritten notes too. Scraps of fabric pinned with a safety pin and a phrase scribbled. You were brave enough to be kinder than the world expects. The challenge arrived like an invitation that was also a dare. The will specified not only a year but a set of conditions written with surprising clarity. He must adopt the name his aunt had chosen and use it in public, register mail under that name, and accept counsel from a woman named Samira, an executor and mentor she trusted, who would check in periodically. At first, he thought the name would be silly, an affectation he could wear like one of her scarves then remove. But names, he learned, are small spells. To speak the chosen name, Layla, she had written, for reasons she refused to explain in her notes, was to open a door he had kept shut. He accepted, not out of theatrical rebellion, but because the house whispered its own logic. That refusal might mean losing the last tangible connection to a woman whose approval had been a rare currency in his life. He had loved Aunt Layla in the way one loves someone who is both magpie and lighthouse, magnetized by her colors, steadied by her directness. She had been the first adult to laugh at what frightened him and to reward him with stories. Her death had left a silence like draft. The will felt like a posthumous request that might, in some strange geometry of grief, be a gift. The first week was practical and clumsy. He changed his name at the post office, his hands sweaty as he signed forms. He ordered a modest set of clothing alterations and bought makeup from a woman behind a glass counter who looked as if she'd been waiting for such moments all her life. People in town noticed, because small places notice names and how they are worn. A clerk at the market smiled and said, "Layla, is it? Your aunt would be pleased." It was a harmless remark, and yet it had the power of a mirror. Other people seeing him as she had imagined he could be made it easier, and sometimes unbearably harder, to see it himself. Samira arrived on a rain-slick Thursday with a black umbrella and a schedule, and with her came the first real test. She wore sensible shoes and a gaze that measured and then, with surprising softness, unmade judgment. "We'll take this slowly," she said. "We'll make a plan." Her plan was not about outfits only. It was structural. It involved paperwork, public appointments in the new name, social situations staged like controlled experiments. The mayor's office, a library volunteer program, a weekly tea circle at the community center. Small arenas in which he would practice being Layla. She taught him how to walk differently. Not theatrical, but with a new alignment that uncoiled tension from his shoulders. She taught him to apply a light layer of foundation, to shape his brows as if each curve could be an argument for gentleness. Adapting was a work of repetition and small humiliations. The first time he stepped into the tea circle wearing a floral dress and the name on his chest, hands reached for him in different ways. Not with malice, but with a soft curiosity saved for rare creatures. Conversations fluttered around recipes and grief and the price of tomatoes, and he found himself responding with a voice that felt as if it belonged to a stranger he had tried on in a theater dressing room. He stumbled through stories about Aunt Layla, and with each stumble a seam of memory repaired. It was strange how the act of being seen softened the edges the world had sharpened. Yet there were nights when, back in the quiet of the house, the mirror showed a man who had borrowed a costume. The reflection held both the man he'd always been and the possibility of someone else. There were practical consequences. Friends asked questions he had not anticipated. A coworker sent a message that read, "Everything okay? Heard about your aunt." He replied in a way that felt like walking a tightrope, honest enough to keep trust, vague enough to preserve mystery. Some relationships frayed, others grew taut with possibility. The house whispered again, its floorboards trained by footsteps whose rhythm he began to learn. In the study, beneath the tied letters, he found a small diary with a lock but no key. Inside were entries in Aunt Layla's looping script that spoke of loneliness and longing, of a nephew who told her jokes in a boyish voice yet liked to embroider the hems of napkins when no one watched. "You are not what the world tells you to be," one line read. "Be what allows your heart to breathe." Suspense settled into him like a second skin. Was he honoring her wish? Or was he being drawn into a story she had written as atonement? The will's edges were exacting. The town's curiosity, inexhaustible. More than once, at the edge of sleep, he imagined her in the doorway, smaller and taller at once, approving him with that crooked smile. Sometimes he imagined her watching from the trunk of a dress, as if she had left a part of herself stitched into the fabric. The challenge, which had seemed at first a series of actions, change your name, live as she believed you to be, began to reveal deeper layers. It was as if the year was less a punishment or reward and more an excavation, an invitation to unearth the person beneath the person he'd always presented to the world. By the time the first month folded into the second, the changes were internal as much as external. He found himself picking up a book on women's lives at the library, not to prove anything, but because the author's sentences felt like companions. He discovered the rhythm of applying lipstick as a ritual rather than a disguise. He learned, clumsily, how to manage small social violences, a man's leer in a market, a neighbor's whispered question, with the coolness of someone who had rehearsed boundaries. He also discovered tenderness where he least expected it. The barista who wrote a small flower beside his name on the cup, a little girl who tugged his sleeve and announced she liked his dress. Yet beneath the new attires and new name, there stirred something quieter, a cautious curiosity about who he was becoming when the costume ceased to feel like borrowing. Aunt Layla's instructions had been absolute, but her reasons were a map she had not fully shared. The house, the trunks, Samira's practical guidance, they were all parts of a slow plan that insisted on patience. He was beginning to understand that the challenge was not only to wear a name but to live its implications. Public, private, legal, intimate. On a late autumn evening, with rain sketching lines on the windowpane and the record player softly spinning an old jazz tune, he sat at the dressing table and opened the smallest drawer. There, beneath a spool of thread and a faded photograph of Aunt Layla at 20, lay a folded envelope addressed to him in the same precise hand. Inside was a single line. "When you can answer me truthfully in the mirror, the next key will appear." It was both a riddle and a benediction. He laughed once, a small brittle sound that broke into a softer, unexpected sob. Outside, Elm Street hummed with the ordinary life of people going to work, to dinner, to places that required no complicated promises. Inside, with a dress draped across a chair and a name now circling his days like a tide, he felt something shift. The year ahead stretched long and luminous. The inheritance had been more than money and a house. It was a request to become someone he had not yet met, and perhaps, to forgive the parts of himself that had been scared of being seen. He turned the envelope over, the paper whispering under his fingers, and for the first time since the reading, he spoke the name aloud. Not to the lawyer, not to Samira, but to the mirror that had tracked his progress. "Layla," he said, and the name settled against the room like the first note of a song. Then, steadier, he asked himself what honesty in that reflection might look like. Days became a gentle blur of repetition. Morning routines that once felt like disguises began to anchor him. The simple act of brushing his hair before the mirror, of selecting a blouse that felt soft against the skin, of applying the faintest blush to his cheeks. Each task no longer felt like a performance. It was rhythm. It was ritual. Layla, the name he wore, had stopped feeling foreign. It had begun to breathe. The first time he caught himself humming as he fastened the small silver locket Aunt Layla had left in the dresser, he froze. The melody was one she used to hum absent-mindedly while watering plants, something halfway between a lullaby and a lament. He didn't remember learning it, yet it spilled out effortlessly. It startled him, this uninvited familiarity, like remembering a dream he hadn't lived. That day, when he walked to the community center for his volunteer shift, he felt a new composure, fragile but real. At the tea circle, people spoke to him differently now. They didn't tilt their heads with curiosity anymore. They smiled with recognition. Mrs. Haniff asked him to help her choose a scarf pattern. The librarian introduced him to a local writer who was looking for volunteers for a reading project. The small gestures of inclusion built an invisible bridge. Tariq, or the ghost of him, watched from somewhere deep inside, unsure whether he was fading or evolving. Samira noticed. "You're softening," she said one afternoon as they sat on the veranda, sipping spiced tea. "Not in weakness, in openness." He laughed quietly. "Or maybe I'm just pretending better." "Pretending," she said, looking at him over the rim of her cup, "always begins the same way, as a lie told to survive. But live it long enough, and it becomes a truth you can't easily set down." Her words lingered, echoing through the house long after she left. That night, he wandered through Aunt Layla's study, drawn by a faint scent of sandalwood. On her desk, the diary he had found earlier was open again, though he was certain he'd closed it. Another entry had appeared, one he hadn't seen before. It was dated 2 years before her death. "He doesn't see what I see. He hides behind the version the world expects. But when he laughs, really laughs, I see her. She is there waiting. Maybe my death will free her." He stared at the words until they blurred. She is there waiting. The notion rattled him, that his aunt had seen not a nephew, but someone buried beneath. It wasn't accusation. It was revelation. The diary entries had begun to feel like messages timed for his discovery, breadcrumbs leading toward something she wanted him to understand. In the weeks that followed, Layla's world expanded. The small town boundaries no longer suffocated him. He started helping with the reading sessions at the library, his voice growing steadier as he read aloud to children. One afternoon, a little boy tugged his sleeve and said, "You sound like my mom when you read stories." It was meant as a compliment, but it struck deeper. The gentleness, the care, the warmth, all things he had never allowed himself to embody, now emerged naturally, unforced. Yet there were moments of conflict. When he visited the old neighborhood to handle paperwork at the engineering firm, an old colleague recognized him. "Tariq," the man said, startled. "Man, what happened?" Layla smiled, a quiet, deliberate smile. "I'm living my aunt's wish." The man frowned. "That's different." "Yes," she said softly. "It is." He walked away trembling, not out of shame, but from the sheer intensity of stepping so completely into the identity his aunt had drawn for him. It was liberating and terrifying all at once. At night, he'd talk aloud to her portrait that hung in the hallway. "You knew what this would do to me, didn't you?" he whispered. "You wanted me to confront myself." The silence that followed was thick, but comforting. The air in the house always seemed to listen. It was during one of these evenings that the next key appeared, just as the letter had promised. A small, golden key lay upon the dressing table, resting atop a folded note written in Aunt Layla's hand. "The wardrobe upstairs. It holds what remains of me, and what will free you." Heart hammering, he climbed the narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking under his weight. The wardrobe was tall, carved from oak, with ornate handles shaped like vines. He inserted the key, and with a hesitant breath turned it. The lock clicked. Inside hung a collection of dresses, elegant, timeless, untouched by dust. But among them was one unlike the rest, a long gown of soft rose silk, with delicate embroidery at the waist. Pinned to its collar was a tag that read simply, "For when she is ready." He didn't touch it at first. He just stood there, staring at the gown as if it breathed. And in that moment, something inside him cracked. A quiet, uncontrollable sob escaped his throat. Because it wasn't just a dress. It was recognition. His aunt had known. Not in theory, not in fantasy, she had known him in a way no one else ever had. He sat on the floor beside the wardrobe until the sun began to rise, tears drying on his cheeks. When morning light spilled across the fabric, he stood and lifted the gown. The silk slid through his fingers like water. It felt impossibly alive, as though it carried a memory of her touch. Slowly, reverently, he put it on. The mirror caught the moment. Not a costume change, not a disguise, but a reunion. His reflection no longer startled him. The man's face softened, lines shifting, expression reshaped by something invisible yet profound. For the first time, he didn't flinch. Later that day, Samira visited again. She stopped short when she saw him standing by the window, the rose gown luminous in the afternoon light. "You found it," she whispered. "She left it for me," he said quietly. "She knew." Samira nodded. "She always knew. She told me you'd reach this moment, when you'd stop asking who you were supposed to be and start feeling it." The days that followed blurred into something peaceful and strange. Layla began to write in a journal of her own, entries about identity, memory, and the fear of losing oneself to find another. The handwriting changed, softer, more fluid. Sometimes she reread Aunt Layla's diary and felt as though the two of them were having a conversation across time. But one night, as she placed the diary back in the drawer, she found a final sealed envelope marked, "Do not open until the 12th month." The sight of it sent a chill through her. What would it reveal? A truth, perhaps, that would undo everything she had come to believe. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Inside, Layla sat at the vanity, gazing at her reflection. No longer Tariq pretending, no longer a man bound by duty, but someone standing on the edge of discovery. The suspense in the air was thick, but it carried a strange sweetness too. Her aunt's plan was not finished. Something deeper awaited. As she extinguished the lamp, the house seemed to hum, its wooden walls whispering their approval. The year wasn't over, and neither was the transformation. Winter arrived quietly, the kind of cold that made every sound softer and every thought louder. The old house on Elm Street held the chill differently. It seemed to breathe warmth from its walls, like Aunt Layla's memory itself was still alive, watching, sheltering. Each morning, Layla would wrap herself in one of her aunt's shawls and sit by the window with tea, the rising steam blurring her reflection. Sometimes she saw Tariq in that reflection, sometimes she didn't. The line between them had begun to fade, not as a loss, but as a merging. Layla had stopped fighting it. She no longer needed to justify what she felt when she dressed, spoke, or moved through the world. Every small act, tying her hair back, choosing her perfume, writing her name at the bottom of a letter, felt like reclaiming something long denied. But with that peace came a quiet ache. There were moments when she wondered if she had truly chosen this path, or if she had simply followed her aunt's map. Did Aunt Layla believe she was guiding him toward truth, or shaping him into her own vision? Samira's visits became rarer. "You don't need me as much anymore," she said one afternoon. "You've learned to listen to yourself." She placed a hand on Layla's shoulder and smiled. "But remember, transformation is not just about living as someone new. It's about forgiving who you were." That night Layla couldn't sleep. She wandered the house barefoot, listening to the whisper of rain against the glass. In the study, the diary lay open again, though she hadn't touched it in days. The ink shimmered faintly, as if freshly written. A new entry had appeared. "The truth is not what I saw in you. It's what you will see when I am gone. I never wanted you to become me. I wanted you to become free." The words made her chest tighten. Free. The word sounded strange in her mind, like an invitation she hadn't yet accepted. She closed the diary, but the sentence stayed with her all night. Weeks passed. The small town had grown used to her presence. No one whispered anymore when she walked to the market or spoke at the library. People smiled and waved, greeting her as though she had always been Layla. The mask had become a face. The performance had become truth. And yet, she still hadn't opened the final envelope, the one marked for the 12th month. On the first day of that month, she placed it on the desk and stared at it for a long time. Her hands trembled, but she finally broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was weaker now, her aunt's illness visible in every letter. "My dear, if you are reading this, then you have walked through every shadow I left for you. You have become who you were meant to be. Not because I willed it, but because you finally listened to the voice that was always yours. There is nothing more to inherit. The house, the clothes, even my name, they were never the gift. You are. Now live your life freely. Keep the name if it feels true. Let it go if it doesn't. Either way, promise me one thing. Never return to hiding." Layla folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. For a long time she just stood there, her heart beating against the paper. Tears came, not of sadness but of understanding. Her aunt hadn't wanted obedience. She had wanted liberation. Later that evening Layla walked outside. The wind was crisp, scented with pine. She wore the rose gown, though it was far too cold for it, and let the fabric ripple like breath. The street was empty, save for the faint sound of a violin playing somewhere in the distance. She whispered into the night, "Thank you, Aunt Layla, for seeing me, even before I did." The world felt both vast and intimate in that moment, as though every light in every house was quietly aware of her. She thought of Tariq, of the boy who once hid behind his reflection, afraid to move toward what he couldn't name. She thought of how far she had come, and how the journey had not been about becoming someone else, but about finally becoming whole. As the wind lifted her hair, she smiled. Not the polite, uncertain smile of the man she had been, but the calm, luminous smile of a woman who had found peace in her own truth. She turned toward the house, its windows glowing warmly behind her, and whispered, "I'm ready." And for the first time the house was silent, not because the whispering had stopped, but because it no longer needed to speak. Spring came early that year, brushing the town in colors that felt too gentle for what Layla carried inside. Flowers returned to Aunt Layla's garden. Violets, lilies, and the stubborn roses that always bloomed no matter how long the winter lingered. The house seemed lighter, freer, as though it too had been waiting for her to finish what her aunt began. But one part of her life still remained untouched, the part she had run from the moment she became Layla. Her husband, Amir. He had written only once since the will's reading. The letter was polite, distant, and confused. He hadn't demanded explanations, only clarity, the kind that never comes easily. For months, she had left it unanswered. But the weight of silence was heavier than the fear of being misunderstood. Now, with the year drawing to its quiet close, she knew what she had to do. That morning she dressed simply. No gown, no makeup, just herself. The road to the city was long and familiar, lined with trees whose branches had seen all versions of her. The quiet man, the grieving nephew, the woman learning to breathe under a new name. Each mile felt like peeling away another layer of fear. Amir's apartment looked unchanged. Same brown door, same neat row of potted plants she had once teased him for overwatering. When he opened the door, time seemed to pause. "Tariq," he said softly. Then, catching himself, "Layla." She nodded, unsure how to begin. The air between them was full of memories. Laughter over burnt dinners, shared exhaustion after long workdays, the slow drift that had settled between them long before Aunt Layla's death. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, stepping aside. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. They sat opposite each other at the kitchen table. The silence stretched, awkward but honest. Then Amir spoke again. "You seem peaceful." Layla smiled faintly. "I think I finally understand what she wanted. It wasn't about pretending. It was about becoming." He leaned back, eyes studying her face. Not with judgment, but with a kind of careful awe. "She always saw something in you," he murmured. "She told me once years ago that you carried 2 songs in your heart, and you only ever let the world hear one." Layla's breath caught. "She told you that?" He nodded. "I didn't understand it then. I thought she meant creativity, maybe sensitivity. But now, I think she knew more than either of us did." They sat in silence again. Outside, the rain began, soft against the window. Layla watched the drops trail down the glass. Slow, certain, unstoppable. "I hurt you," she said finally. "I disappeared without giving you a chance to understand." "You were trying to survive," he replied quietly. "I can see that now." She looked up at him, really looked, and for the first time since all this began, she didn't see disappointment or confusion in his eyes. She saw grief, yes, but also recognition. "I loved you," he said. "I still care for you. But I think the person I loved is gone, and maybe that's okay." Tears stung her eyes, but she smiled. "She's not gone," she whispered. "She's finally alive." Amir nodded slowly, and the smile he gave her was gentle, not bitter. "Then I'm glad I got to meet her." They talked for hours, about the past, the house, the letter, the lessons Aunt Layla had hidden in every challenge. He told her how her absence had made him reflect on his own silences, on the ways he had failed to see her pain before it became unbearable. It wasn't confession, it was closure. When she stood to leave, Amir walked her to the door. "So what now?" he asked softly. Layla took a deep breath. "Now I live. Not as who I was told to be. Not even as who Aunt Layla imagined me to be. Just me." He nodded, and for a moment neither moved. Then he said, "You always looked happiest when you were creating something. Don't stop creating." "I won't." As she stepped outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and bright. She turned back one last time. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For seeing me, even when it hurt." The door closed softly behind her, but the weight in her chest had lifted. The past was not erased. It was integrated, forgiven. On the long drive home, Layla felt the first real quiet in her mind. Not the empty quiet of grief, but the full quiet of acceptance. The house on Elm Street awaited her, lights glowing softly like patient eyes. When she entered, she placed her hand on the old wooden table where Aunt Layla's final letter still rested. "It's done," she whispered. "You were right. I had to face him to face myself." The house didn't whisper this time. It simply breathed with her, warm and alive. That night, Layla opened her journal and wrote, "I am not who I was. I am not only who she imagined. I am both, and neither. I am becoming endlessly." As she placed the pen down, she smiled through her tears. The journey her aunt had set in motion was no longer about transformation. It was about truth. Quiet, unadorned, radiant truth. The year's end arrived quietly, without ceremony. No thunder of endings. No clear sign that one life was closing and another beginning. Just morning sunlight filtering through lace curtains and the faint smell of jasmine from the garden. It was exactly 1 year since the will had been read, and the house, Aunt Layla's house, had kept its promise. It had held her, changed her, and waited for her to understand. Layla woke early, heart steady, the kind of calm that comes only after every question has been asked. She dressed simply in a pale blue shawl and poured herself a cup of tea. On the table lay the journal she had filled over 12 months, each page a record of confusion, grief, joy, and rediscovery. The handwriting on the first page belonged to a man searching for direction. The handwriting on the last was hers, sure, flowing, alive. The house was still, but she felt its presence all the same. It had become a living companion, a vessel of memory and spirit. She walked through each room slowly, touching the furniture, the framed photos, the books her aunt had underlined with almost reckless enthusiasm. Everything she passed carried traces of her, and now of Layla too. In the study, sunlight fell across the desk where the final letter had once rested. She thought that was the end of her aunt's guidance, but as she sat down, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small wooden box sat in the corner of the drawer, half hidden beneath a loose sheet of paper. Inside it was a folded note tied with a red ribbon, yellowed at the edges. Her breath caught. The note was addressed not to Tariq or Layla, but simply, "To you when you finally know." Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were two things: a short letter and an old photograph, one she had never seen before. It showed her aunt as a young woman, standing beside someone who looked strikingly familiar. Not identical but unmistakable, the same eyes, the same tilt of the smile. The person in the photograph could have been her, years younger, if she had been born a woman. The letter read, "My dearest, if you have found this, it means you have already become the person you were always meant to be. There is something you never knew. Something I kept not as a secret but as a kindness. You were not my nephew by blood. You were the child of my sister, who could not raise you, and I chose to protect that truth until you were ready. Your mother, my sister, wanted you to grow without fear. She believed, as I did, that you were born with a spirit beyond what the world could easily name. I saw her in you. I saw the same light, the same quiet struggle between who you were and who you thought you had to be. That is why I left you this journey, not as a punishment but as a return home. Blood never mattered, only truth. And now you know both." The room blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She traced the faces in the photograph, her aunt and the woman beside her, smiling as though the world had not yet tried to define them. It wasn't just inheritance, it was lineage. Her mother had given her life. Her aunt had given herself. The realization hit gently, not as shock but as relief. Every test, every challenge, every silence had led her here, to the understanding that identity was never about becoming something new, but about remembering something ancient inside her. She placed the photograph beside the diary and looked out the window. The garden was in full bloom again. The roses, Aunt Layla's roses, were brighter than ever, each petal holding sunlight as if storing memories. That afternoon, Samira came for one final visit. She smiled when she saw Layla waiting on the porch. "You've completed the year," she said. Layla nodded. "Yes, but I think the year was never about finishing. It was about starting." Samira's eyes softened. "Then you've understood perfectly." They sat together for a while, not speaking much, letting the quiet do the talking. When Samira left, Layla stood alone in the doorway. The sun was setting, that perfect hour when light and shadow held hands. She took one last slow walk through the house. When she reached the bedroom mirror, she stopped. Her reflection met her eyes calmly, steadily. For the first time, she didn't see the difference between Tariq and Layla. She saw continuity. A soul unchanged by names or expectations, only freed by truth. She smiled, the same smile her aunt once had, and whispered, "Thank you for believing in me before I did." Then, with quiet resolve, she turned off the lights and stepped outside. The evening air wrapped around her like silk. The path ahead was open, unmarked. No more tests, no more disguises, no more waiting. Just life, her life, waiting to be lived on her own terms. She glanced back one last time at the house on Elm Street. "Goodbye," she whispered. "And thank you." As the wind moved through the garden, the roses swayed, not in farewell, but in gentle applause. Layla smiled, tears glistening but no longer heavy, and walked forward into the twilight, free, whole, and finally home within herself. Final line. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our channel.